Before the pyramids, before Rome, before Athens, there was Sumer. On the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates, humans built the first cities, raised the first temples, and carved the first words into clay. This is the story of the world's very first civilization, its rise, its betrayals, and the legacy that still shapes our lives today. 5,000 years ago, when much of the world still lived in scattered tribes and hunted across forests and plains, a miracle unfolded in a narrow strip of land between two great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. This was Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers. The soil here was rich, the floods seasonal, and for those bold enough to shape it, the land offered life. From these waters, the Sumerians emerged, a people whose vision would give birth to the very idea of civilization. At first, they were farmers, carving out canals with crude tools, channeling river water into thirsty fields. But farming demanded unity. Families came together, then clans, and then villages. Slowly, villages swelled into towns. And those towns, unlike anything seen before, grew into cities. The world's first cities. Imagine walking through Uruk around 3200 BCE. Its massive walls stretched over 6 miles, enclosing tens of thousands of people. Towering above all stood the ziggurat, a step pyramid temple made of mud brick that seemed to scrape the heavens. People believed these temples were stairways for the gods to descend, places where the divine met the human. Around its base, markets thrived. Merchants shouted, farmers bartered grain for wool, and traders offered exotic stones from faraway lands. The air was filled with the sounds of hammers, bleating sheep, and the chanting of priests. The Sumerians invented something the world had never seen before: writing. They pressed reeds into wet clay, carving cuneiform signs that transformed fleeting speech into permanent record. With writing, they recorded debts, trade agreements, prayers, even stories. For the first time in history, human memory leapt beyond the mind. Ideas could outlive their makers. And with writing came something else: history. This was no longer a world of nameless generations. Kings could leave behind their laws. Priests could preserve their rituals. Poets could carve their tales into clay so that thousands of years later, we can still hear their voices. The Sumerians gave humanity the gift of permanence. But permanence also brought ambition. Cities grew proud, walls grew taller, and rulers dreamed of more than survival. They dreamed of power, glory, and immortality. And with that, Sumer stepped onto the stage of history, not just as farmers or traders, but as builders of a civilization that would inspire everything to come. As the Sumerian towns grew into cities, each became more than a cluster of homes. They were worlds unto themselves, proud and fiercely independent, ruled not just by leaders, but by gods. Every city had its patron deity, and the people believed the city existed to serve that god. Ur was the city of Nana, the moon god. Uruk belonged to Inanna, goddess of love and war. Lagash honored Ningirsu, a god of strength. To live in a city was to live under the protection of a divine power. At the heart of each stood the ziggurat, a towering step pyramid that dominated the skyline. These were not temples for worshippers to enter, but massive platforms for the gods themselves. Priests performed rituals at the top, where heaven and earth were thought to meet. Offerings of bread, beer, and cattle burned in sacred fires, the smoke rising to please the divine. To the Sumerians, the ziggurat was not just a building. It was a bridge between mortal and eternal. Beneath these holy towers, life bustled with energy. Farmers streamed in with baskets of barley, the lifeblood of the Sumerian diet. Merchants shouted in crowded bazaars, trading wool, oil, and beer. Artisans crafted fine jewelry of lapis lazuli, imported all the way from Afghanistan, and carvers etched delicate patterns into stone seals used to mark ownership. And everywhere, scribes scratched symbols into clay. They became the keepers of knowledge, recording trade accounts, contracts, hymns, and even the first literature. These scribes were both feared and respected. In a world where most could not read, they held the power of memory itself. But the glory of Sumer was not just in trade and ritual. It was in the bold experiment of government. At first, the cities were ruled by assemblies of elders, guided by priests who claimed to speak for the gods. But as cities grew larger and conflicts grew sharper, a new kind of leader emerged. The Lugal, literally big man, the king. He was not just a ruler but a warlord, a builder, and a symbol of divine favor. Kingship itself was seen as a gift from the gods, handed down to humanity. Uruk, the greatest of all, produced one such legendary king, Gilgamesh. Though his story was later immortalized in myth, Gilgamesh may have been a real ruler around 2700 BCE. Under him, Uruk reached its peak. Its walls stretched so vast that later generations could only marvel. Did not Gilgamesh build these walls, whose foundations are as old as the world? The rise of kings brought with it order and ambition. Massive irrigation projects extended water to fields, transforming deserts into farmland. Temples expanded into sprawling complexes, storing grain and redistributing wealth. Armies formed, marching under banners, bronze weapons gleaming in the sun. The cities became not only centers of worship, but engines of power. Yet this very independence carried a seed of trouble. Each city saw itself as chosen, its god supreme, its king rightful master. They flourished side by side, but they did not unite. Instead, a rivalry simmered. Farmers fought over canals, priests argued over divine favor, and kings eyed their neighbors' lands. The glory of the city-states was dazzling, but fragile. For now, though, the cities stood proud. The world had never seen anything like them. Stone, walls, palaces, armies, laws, art, and literature, all bound together in a rhythm of daily life. To walk through Ur or Uruk at this time was to feel the pulse of something entirely new. Civilization at its dawn, brimming with ambition, creativity, and hope. The Sumerians believed they had been chosen by the gods to build order out of chaos, and in many ways, they succeeded. They gave humanity its first great experiment in urban life, in writing, in law, in kingship. It was a golden age, but as history has often shown, golden ages do not last forever. The brilliance of the Sumerian city-states came with a price: competition. Each city believed its god was supreme, and its destiny was to rule the others. And so, as quickly as irrigation canals stretched across the plains, armies marched beside them, spears glinting in the Mesopotamian sun. Imagine the land in those days. Wide fields of golden barley rippling in the wind, oxen pulling wooden plows, shepherds driving flocks across green pastures. Above this peaceful landscape rose fortified walls, thick and high, surrounding cities that bristled with watchtowers. But beneath that peace lay tension, always ready to ignite. The first rivalries were small, fights over farmland and water. Canals, carefully dug to feed crops, often cut across boundaries. One city might divert water upstream, starving another's fields. Farmers shouted, priests cursed, and soon kings gathered their warriors. Spears and slings clashed where once only barley had grown. Over time, the struggles grew bigger, more organized, more brutal. One of the earliest wars we know of was between the cities of Umma and Lagash. They fought not for glory, but for the fertile land along their borders. For decades the feud simmered, flaring into battles, truces, and betrayals. The king of Lagash boasted of victories and inscriptions, carving into stone the image of soldiers trampling their enemies. The war was not only about land, it was about pride, about proving whose god was greater, whose city was destined to lead. But the enemies of Sumer were not only neighbors. Beyond the walls of their cities stretched vast lands filled with restless peoples. To the east lay Elam, a mountain kingdom rich and ambitious. To the north, nomadic tribes wandered, their eyes on the wealth of Sumer. To the west, deserts gave way to other rival states eager to share in the spoils of civilization. The Sumerians had gold, grain, beer, and precious stones. They had temples filled with offerings, warehouses overflowing with goods, and armies armed with bronze. Such wealth was irresistible. Outsiders raided, tested the walls, and sometimes even broke through. Each invasion left scars, reminders that, while Sumer's gods were mighty, they did not always shield their people. Inside the cities, conflict also brewed. Priests and kings sometimes clashed for power. Priests claimed divine authority, holding the keys to the gods' favor. Kings, however, commanded soldiers and built walls. The balance was delicate. Too much power in one hand could upset the city's harmony. Ambitious rulers sometimes declared themselves chosen by the gods, leaving priests sidelined. Other times, temples grew wealthy enough to rival the palace itself. For the people, war was both a burden and a way of life. Farmers were conscripted into armies, leaving fields untended. Women and children waited anxiously as their men marched off to fight. Victories brought spoils, but defeats brought hunger and despair. Yet through it all, the Sumerians endured, adapting their strategies, building stronger walls, and improving their weapons. It was in this crucible of conflict that innovation thrived. Chariots rolled onto the battlefield, pulled by donkeys. Spears grew sharper, shields stronger. Fortifications expanded, with massive gates and moats. Warfare was brutal, but it pushed the Sumerians to develop technology and organization that would echo through history. And yet, even as they fought each other and outsiders, the Sumerians could not see the larger danger forming on the horizon. While city fought city, unity slipped further away. While kings chased personal glory, the people's strength was drained. The gods they trusted seemed silent as blood soaked the fields. This endless cycle of rivalry left the land weakened, vulnerable. And beyond their rivers, beyond their walls, a new power was stirring. A man named Sargon would soon rise in Akkad, leading an army not bound by city loyalty, but by his command alone. He watched the Sumerians exhaust themselves in their battles, and he understood what they did not. Divided, they could be conquered. For now, the city-states continued their clashes, each convinced it would prevail, each certain its walls were eternal. But history was already shifting. The golden age of rivalry was about to give way to an age of conquest. The walls of Sumer's cities still gleamed in the sun. Priests climbed the steps of their ziggurats, kings sat on thrones carved with lions, and merchants filled the bazaars with the clamor of trade. On the surface, life seemed strong, but inside, cracks were spreading. Rivalries between cities had drained resources, endless wars had cost countless lives, and unity, the one thing that might have saved them, was nowhere to be found. Into this fractured world stepped a man whose ambition would change everything: Sargon of Akkad. His story, like so many in Mesopotamia, began humbly. Legend says he was the child of a priestess, set adrift in a basket on the river, rescued and raised by a gardener. He grew up far from thrones or temples, yet he carried within him an iron will and a gift for leadership. Sargon did not see himself as just another city ruler. He dreamed bigger. While Sumerian kings fought over canals and border fields, Sargon looked to the whole land, to all of Mesopotamia. He began as a cupbearer in the court of Kish, but he was no servant for long. With charisma, cunning, and ruthless determination, he won soldiers to his side, forged alliances, and finally seized power by force. From there, his star only rose. The timing could not have been more perfect. Sumer's city-states were exhausted, locked in rivalries that had bled them dry. Each believed its god made it supreme, but Sargon believed something else entirely: that one man, with one army, could rule them all. One by one. The cities fell before him. Uruk, Ur, Lagash, all the proud centers of Sumerian civilization bent to his will. Their walls, once thought unbreachable, crumbled before the relentless advance of Akkadian soldiers. Their kings, once boasting of divine favor, found themselves prisoners or corpses. But conquest alone was not enough. Sargon understood betrayal, how division and ambition could be turned into weapons sharper than any spear. He exploited rivalries, turning city against city, priest against king. Promises of power lured allies, who then found themselves trapped. Old loyalties shattered. The very spirit of independence that had once made Sumer strong became the weakness Sargon drove his blade into. When the smoke cleared, Sumer no longer stood as a collection of free cities. For the first time in history, Mesopotamia was united under a single ruler. Sargon proclaimed himself not just king of Akkad, but king of the four corners of the world. It was the first empire humanity had ever seen, and it was built on the ruins of Sumer's disunity. To the people of Sumer, it must have felt like betrayal. Their kings had promised protection, their priests had promised the gods favor, but in the end, both had failed. The proud cities that once declared themselves chosen by the heavens were now provinces of a foreign power. The gods of Akkad were raised above their own. Even their language, once the voice of the world, began to be overshadowed by Akkadian. And yet Sumer was not erased. Its culture, its inventions, its spirit lived on even under Akkadian rule. The scribes still pressed cuneiform into clay, though now they recorded Akkadian victories. The ziggurats still rose toward the sky, though new rulers claimed them. The people still tilled their fields and told their stories, even as the names of their kings faded into dust. The fall of Sumer was not sudden, like a city burned in a single night. It was gradual, like a mighty river slowly redirected. But for those who remembered the glory days of Ur and Uruk, the loss must have cut deep. Once they had believed themselves the first and greatest. Now they were subjects, their pride humbled, their power broken. History often turns on betrayal, not only of allies and enemies, but of ideals. Sumer betrayed itself by refusing unity, and in that betrayal Sargon found his victory. Yet even in their fall, the Sumerians gave the world a gift. For their ideas, their writings, their very way of life would outlive Sargon and his empire. The conqueror's glory would fade, but the seeds of civilization Sumer planted would endure. Though Sumer's political power faded, its legacy became immortal. Empires rose and fell across Mesopotamia, the Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, but all of them built upon the foundations Sumer had laid. The world's first civilization may have lost its independence, but it had already changed humanity forever. The greatest of its gifts was writing. Long before parchment or books, Sumerian scribes pressed wedge-shaped marks into wet clay tablets. At first, these were simple: tallies, numbers for sheep, measures of barley, lists of goods. But over time, the symbols grew into words, and words grew into stories. By inventing cuneiform, the Sumerians gave humans the power to preserve memory beyond speech. For the first time, laws could be written, prayers recorded, wisdom passed, down unchanged. Knowledge no longer died with the storyteller, it lived in clay. From this writing blossomed the first great literature. The Epic of Gilgamesh, carved into tablets, told of kings, gods, and the search for immortality. It asked questions still asked today. What does it mean to be human? How do we face death? What gives life purpose? These were not the thoughts of a simple people. They were the reflections of a civilization reaching for meaning beyond survival. Sumer also gave us order through law. Long before Hammurabi's famous code, Sumerian cities wrote down rules for contracts, debts, and punishments. They believed justice was not just divine will, but something that could be organized, debated, and enforced. The very idea of law as a structure, something greater than any single king, was born here. Mathematics, too, flowed from Sumer. Using a system based on 60, they measured fields, calculated rations, and charted the heavens. To this day, our minutes and seconds come from Sumer's sexagesimal system. They tracked the movements of stars and planets, not only for omens, but for calendars, predicting floods and seasons. Astronomy and astrology were twins in their world, guiding both farming and fate. Even the wheel, so ordinary now, was first crafted here. What began as a tool for pottery became a revolution in transport and war. Carts rolled across plains, carrying grain farther and faster. Chariots thundered into battle, changing the face of warfare forever. With every turn of the wheel, humanity moved forward. And then there was urban life itself. Streets, markets, temples, schools, all the rhythms of city living were pioneered by Sumer. They built walls to protect, canals to feed, palaces to govern. Their experiment in living together in great numbers, with shared rules and shared gods, became the blueprint for every civilization that followed. Though later empires tried to eclipse them, traces of Sumer never vanished. The Babylonians copied their cuneiform. The Assyrians worshipped many of the same gods. Even the Bible remembers Sumer faintly, in the story of Ur and the Tower of Babel. Their spirit lived on, not as conquerors but as teachers. And so, when we speak today of civilization, of cities, of writing, of laws and learning, we are speaking of Sumer. They were the first to step out of the shadows of prehistory and leave a written record of their lives, their fears, their hopes. They showed that humanity could build not just villages, but whole worlds, bound together by imagination and order. Their story is not only about rise and fall, it is about the enduring power of ideas. Armies conquered their walls, but no army could erase the marks pressed into clay. Kings ruled for lifetimes, but no king could silence the questions etched in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Temples crumbled, empires dissolved, but the inventions of Sumer carried forward, flowing into every corner of history. We still live in their shadow. Every time we write, measure time, follow laws, or walk through a city, we echo Sumer. Their ziggurats may be ruins, their kings forgotten, but their legacy endures. Quiet, invisible, eternal. And so, the story of Sumer is not just the story of a people who once lived by the Tigris and Euphrates. It is the story of all of us. For in their clay tablets, their wheels, their laws, and their dreams, they lit the spark of civilization, a flame that still burns today. The ziggurats have crumbled, the kings are dust, and the empires that conquered Sumer are long gone. But every time we write, measure time, follow laws, or live in cities, we are walking in their footsteps. Sumer was the first civilization in history, and its legacy still lives in all of us today.